All right, guys, welcome back. We are now on the second section of the NSE4, right? To where we are going over the infrastructure portion of the network security engineering exam for Fortinet. Okay. The first section we're going to go over is routing, right? I told you guys, right? The core skill, the foundational skill that you need to have is routing and switching, right? I know we had a couple of sessions on it, but I want you guys, of course, to take whatever you can from this session. Definitely, do some reading on your own, okay? Learn as much as you can, lab as much as you can, understand the path of a packet, right? From a layer 3 standpoint, right? So you can be an efficient network security engineer, okay? All right, let's go ahead and get started, right? So after we, get through this entire section, right? Section 1, which will be routing on a FortiGate, right? You should be able to go ahead and identify what capabilities of routing, like dynamic or static routing, is capable, right, on a FortiGate, right? You should be able to configure static routing, right? You should also be able to implement policy-based routes, right? And you should also be able to control traffic for well-known internet services using the ISDB objects, okay? All right, so let's talk about it. What is routing, right? So routing is how the FortiGate in NAT mode decides where to send packets that it receives and the packets that it generates, okay? All right, NAT mode means that it's running at layer 3. Remember that, okay? All network devices that perform routing have a routing table, right? A routing table contains a series of rules. Each rule specifies the next hop, right? Next hop being the next device that we are going to send this packet to, okay? Which may or may not be the final destination of the packet, but we at least know where to forward it, okay? Each routing hop in the routed path requires a routing table lookup to pass the packet along until it reaches final destination. And if you guys remember, right, like I told you guys, with the routing, right, with layer 3, everything is about a source and a destination. Okay. So when does FortiGate, right, it's going ahead and it's doing its job, it's in that mode. Okay, I want to make sure in that mode it's routing these packets, right? The FortiGate will first, it won't look at the policies first. It will look at its routing table first, right? Look at all of its entries and say, do I have an entry, right, for this packet's destination address? Okay. So when it's trying to go ahead and look, right, and try to find a match, right, it's going to go through the entire routing table, right, to find the most specific, right, the most specific match for the address that's in the destination address within that packet at layer 3. Okay. So if, right, it's going, now we're talking about it's going through that table. If the FortiGate finds multiple matches, right, for the destination, right, is going to use various attributes. Of course, we're going to talk about it soon. Various route attributes to determine the best route, right? With routing, right, with implementing FortiGate that's going to be running in that mode, you have to make sure that you properly configure and you properly design, right, your network, right? So you have a proper configuration for your routing, right? And so that your packets can flow, right, progressively, and that they can reach the destination. Okay. Any questions so far?
No, not for me.
Okay. All right. All right. So by default, right, the FortiGate, right, whenever, maybe a host with, on the inside of a network is trying to reach to the outside, right? Anytime, right, packets are flowing through the FortiGate, right? That is a session, okay? And so, and that session is tracked by the FortiGate, right? And it's going to do that with all these sessions, right, that are flowing through the FortiGate. And it's going to track these sessions, right? What does this mean? Well, that means the FortiGate is stateful, right? It's going to track every session state that flows through the firewall, right? Right? But before it decides to go ahead and initiate that session, right? It's going to do two things. It's going to do a route lookup, right? First, it's going to go ahead and take a look at the first packet that flows in, right? That it's sent by the source, right? Then it is going to go ahead, right? It's going to see that. It's going to see the first packet, look at the source and destination where it has to go to. Excellent, right? That's the first part of the session, right? But that packet needs to come back, okay? Right? To finish that session, to finish that communication, right? And so there's going to be a response back from the destination, right? And so for that session, right, because the FortiGate is stateful, is going to get that packet coming back and do another routing lookup and say, hey, I see the source, which was previously the destination. Now I need to look where I need to send this to. It's going to do another lookup there, right? So after it completes, right, those two lookups, right, what the FortiGate is going to do, right, it's going to say, let's go ahead, right, and write this routing information in the session table that has, right? And so now any packets after that, right, for this session, it no longer has to do route lookups, right? It no longer has to waste CPU, has to waste resources within the FortiGate to go ahead and do multiple route lookups, right? Because that'll overburden our CPU if we have to do that for a huge enterprise, right? Now it's going to lock, right? Lock that in to its session table and begin flowing those packets through. Okay. Now, when would be a time where, even though the session has started, right, and it does its two lookups, right? What would be an instance to where it would do additional lookups beyond the two? Well, if Donovan, right, Donovan is working on the firewalls, right, and he says, oh, you know what? Let me go ahead and change the routes, right? The routes in my firewall while it's in production, right? So Markavia, right, she can be going ahead and passing traffic through the firewall if, right, Don changes those routes, right, while she's passing traffic, right? That session will do another two lookups because there was an active change to the firewall to the routing table, right? And so now it needs to write to the session table again so that it can go ahead and pass that traffic. Does that make sense? All right. So static routes, right? You guys have
So
done this before.
so it's gonna stop the session pretty much if she makes a change while the package is flowing, just to kind of like make sure I understand. I was on mute. I'm sorry.
You're good. So it's not necessarily going to stop the session. It's going to be in a state of waiting, of doing multiple lookups, right? And it's going to try it roughly 5 times, right? And so after it does it, right? After it, it doesn't see anything, or if it does, right? It's as soon as it sees a change, it's first going to go ahead and flush all the sessions, right? Right? It's not going to
Mhm.
stop it. It's just going to flush it, flush those sessions and restart it, right? So her packets, let's say she's doing pings, right? So she's going to see those pings. You change the route, right? She's not going to see an interrupt. It's just going to restart, right? It's going
Okay.
to take another path. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Hmm.
Right? And so now the session table has to learn the changes from the routing table.
Got you.
Does that make
So it's gonna
sense?
be like like kind of like latency type of thing when you ping at something. It's just gonna take longer.
So we
Or no,
have to
I'm
be
just
careful on the words that we use. We don't
mhm.
want to use the word latency, right? What we want to use is there will be a change in the routing table,
Okay.
which would cause it for a change in a session table, but that will not affect the host that's passing traffic.
Okay.
Your job as the router, aka firewall, is to pass that traffic, which you will from a layer 3 standpoint. The session, right, is an internal function within the FortiGate. The FortiGate will take care of that, right? It'll pick that back up. But as far as packets, nothing will be stopped.
Okay.
A session table will just go ahead and say, oh, excellent. It'll be milliseconds. It'll say, oh, okay, excellent. I got to go ahead and say this new route that Don put in. Bet. That makes sense?
Yep.
Now, if you entirely take out the route and don't put in a new route, right? You're essentially killing the entire routing table. So now that session would be stopped.
Okay.
Right? But if you're replacing a route, right, you're putting in a new route, it's just going to go ahead and say, oh, I see something that's more specific. Let's go ahead and send it that way. That's what it's going to do. So that session, it'll just take a different path.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, you guys see me time and time again configure a static route, right? But what is it, right? Static route is a route that's configured manually, right? Plain and simple, right? And so whenever my Kivia goes ahead and jump on the FortiGate and says, hey, if you see this packet, right? If you see packets from this source, right, that needs to go to this destination, right, or that's just destined for this destination, send it to, right? Send it to or towards the next hop, right? Or the gateway, right? Or the next router, right? And use this interface to send it out. Okay? That's a static route, right? And we can get into details and talk about AD, aka administrative distance, right? But this is how to go ahead and configure a static route. Right? We can go ahead and do it by named address. Maybe my Keyman went ahead and configured a address object or a address group object, right? To go ahead and match it. Or she can use an internet service database object, right? To go ahead and define the destination. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, here's a little review going back to our routing and switching week and when we did the path of a packet, right? This is for layer 3 only. This is not for layer 2, right? This is only for layer 3, right? So you wouldn't see, you wouldn't have to plan for a spanning tree. You wouldn't have to be planning for LACP. You wouldn't have to be planning for a lot of these layer 2 protocol. This is a layer 3 device. We're talking about routing. Okay, so it is a router. Does that make sense? Okay, take that as a yes. So let's keep going, right? So we talked about an address object, right? You guys seen address object before, right? But you can actually use it, right, to go ahead and define a static route, right? So she can, let's say my Kiwi went ahead and she has a group, right? A group of places that, hosts need to get to. She can define address objects, put them in a group, and use the named address function as the destination and set the gateway, right? The big thing that we need to do, right? And hopefully you guys can see where my mouse is. If she's going to do that, if any of you guys are going to do that, that's listening to this, you need to make sure that you set the function of static route configuration, you toggle it to green. If not, your static route for a address object or a named address will not work. Okay? That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so.
I had a question though.
Yes, sir.
How would you configure a route? Like, say, for example, if I wanted to, I have a corporation and I know that I have I wanted to Teams to use a separate route, like for application itself.
Yep.
Like, how would that be configured in the static routes? Would you use like, is that under like internet service, or like, how would that be used?
I would never take you to a movie theater. You're spoiling the movie before we get there, Don.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. Okay.
It's all
Okay,
good.
it's right. Okay, it's covered. I can wait.
It's
I can
all
wait.
good. It's
I
all
can
good.
wait.
It's all good. We'll get there. We'll
Yeah, I
get
can
there.
wait. I can wait.
No, I'll go ahead and answer your question. But yes, right? And it's actually recommended that you do so. And to do that, right? We'll use your example, call Teams, right? The FortiGate, right, from FortiGuard, it has predefined, right? Predefined address objects, right? In its internet service database, right? And so it pulled this database of IP addresses and domains from our end, right? And it said these are trusted IP addresses, right, from the internet database, right? And so we can go, you guys can go ahead and you guys are certified from us. As long as you have a license with FortiGuard, we certify that this is an updated list. Okay. And so if Don, right, Don and Makivia has an organization, they say, hey, I don't want to go through the list of trying to figure out the different domains for Teams. Can I just tell my FortiGate to say, hey, allow Teams, right? Allow Teams, right, through my firewall. And to get to Teams, I'm going to get and set a static route for Teams. You can click the Internet Service object, right, Internet Service button, and you'll see a drop down just like how it is for named addresses. And you'll be able to pick Microsoft Teams, right? Let's say it's YouTube. You can do the same thing, YouTube. And of course, right, a lot of these organizations, right, they have instances in the cloud, right, and they have multiple data centers, right, for failover and redundancy, what have you, right? Maybe they'll have a failure that happens, right? And maybe your users are connecting to your data center that's in New York. You have a failure, and it fails over to maybe the data center that's across the water, right? That's maybe in London, right?
Mhm.
Your FortiGate will not have to look up the IP address of the London data center. What will happen is the FortiGate will say, and I know I'm going ahead, the FortiGate will say, it's ISDB, right? My database from FortiGuard says if it's certified from Microsoft Teams, I know how to get there. And my FortiGate is going to do the lookup, right? It's going to send it up to its DNS, and it's going to go ahead and do that lookup by itself. I don't need to statically set that. And it's dangerous to do so anyway, because you never know if those IP addresses would change. Okay. So again, you would go ahead and set this up, right, using your ISDB, and then you'll do the same thing on your firewall policy, right? You configure a firewall policy using your ISDB. Now remember what we talked about, right, in the security section. You can create a policy with an ISDB, but that's it. You can't include an ISDB and a address object of an IP address, right? So it has to be it either has to be solely just ISDB or, right, or an address object. It can't be those both in a destination or has a source. Make sense?
Yeah. Now that you say that, I remember you actually went over that.
It's
Now
all
that I hear
good.
you say that. Yep. All right.
It's all good. It's all good. Does it make sense though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, all right. So let's go ahead. Good question, man. All right. So I personally, right, I don't want to go over this and speak this at you as far as dynamic routes, right? I'm just going to read what's on the slide. I want us to have more fun when it comes to the lab. Just know dynamic routing, right? It's a way for routes to be learned, right? Without having to statically set them, right? And how are they learned? They're learned by different protocols, right? Different different routing protocols that are have been in place for years, right? You have OSPF, Open Shortest Path First, BGP, ISIS, and RIP, which is way old. Okay, so right to enable right to configure dynamic routing, right? You would have to go to system and then feature visibility to go ahead and enable it, right? Enable advanced routing. Then you would go ahead and configure that, right? You would have your option not just to dynamic routing, but of course to policy routes, to routing objects, right? And to my favorite, right? Multicast. Okay. We're not going to go over this now. I want to really have fun in the lab and for us to go over each of these dynamic routing concepts. We touched on it in the CCNA section, but we're going to do it again within a lab, but with the FortiGate this time. Okay. All right. But just the key thing with dynamic routes is that it is the opposite of static routes. You're not configuring it manually. Your FortiGate, right? As long as you configure dynamic routing, it will learn those routes auto-magically, okay, by connecting to other devices. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's talk about policy-based routes, right? So static routes are simple and they're used in small networks, right? Not really huge networks, right? Policy-based routes, right? A little bit more, you got a little bit more granular look at them, right? And you can go ahead and set them up so that they can match more than just one destination, right? Or more than just a destination address, right? So I'm going to go ahead and use your team's example, right? We can go ahead and set a policy route that says, all right, so for packets that are coming in to port 3, right? Let's say that's my local area network, right? And the source, right? Because maybe, right? Maybe you have a setup to where your inside address is not your address for your actual interface on your FortiGate, right? So maybe there's some routing going on between your internal network, right? Don, right, and my keybit can go ahead and say, hey, source address is this, okay? So if I get packets coming from this interface, right, I can set that up, right? I don't have to create an address object. I can say the destination is this, right? I can go ahead and specify the protocol, and I can actually get deep and say, what source ports am I going to allow? What destination ports am I going to allow? The type of service, right, as it relates to type of service as far as it relates to QoS, right, quality of service, right, and you'll be able to go ahead and set an action, right? So it's an if-then statement. Remember, we went over that whenever we configured policies, right? So you guys can read it from the top. If incoming traffic matches X, Y, and Z, right? And so you see under the second box, you see then action either forward that traffic or I stop policy routing. Okay? Right? But it has to match this first, right? In the regular, right? In the regular, firewall policies, right? In that if statement, we have the source and the destination, right? And tell it where to go, right? But now it's the policy saying, hey, here's the port, right? Here's the subnet, right? Right? Here's the subnet. I can add a few more addresses. Here's a destination. I can add a few more addresses, maybe an ISDP in the destination, right? I can actually go ahead and configure the protocol, which you can do in the firewall policy. I can actually set the port numbers, right? Which of course will take more work within the firewall policy, right? I can go ahead and configure TLS, right? Type of service. Then to say to act on this condition or not. Okay? The real important thing is that a policy-based route always supersedes the regular routing table on a FortiGate. So policy-based routes are its own routing table. Okay? So if packets are coming in and they match the policy-based routes, it's going to look at that routing table first. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now, and I want to make sure I go over this slowly because I know this could be a lot. So when a packet matches a policy route, right? What the FortiGate is going to do is take two actions. It's either A, going to route that packet to the configured destination, so the interface and the gateway, right? Bypassing the routing table, right? It's not even going to look at the routing table. Or it's going to stop checking the policy routes, right? So we're going to have a match, right? We're going to say if yada, 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 right? Right? And so it's going to check all that. And if I have stop policy routing, right? What the policy-based route is saying, hey, for things that match this, go ahead and check the actual routing table, not the policy-based routing table. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Now keep in mind, right? So for a policy route to forward traffic out of a specific interface, there should be an active route for that destination using that interface in the routing table. Okay? Otherwise, the policy route does not work. Okay? You can think of this, right? You can think of a policy-based routing table as if the firewall policy and the routing table came together, made a baby, and now it's all in one. Make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, Don, your question before you spoiled it. Right?
I mean, I know the answer now.
It's okay. It's okay. So, good question by Don, by the way, right? So, what if we, right, we use Teams as our example. What if we need to route traffic to Teams, right, or a public internet service, right, through a specific WAN link, right, right? And the situation is, Mike and Don, right, them both being the network security engineers organization, right? They have two ISPs, right, for redundancy, right? They're great engineers. They want to plan for that, right? Maybe Makivia and Don agreed that we have a faster pipe through WAN 1 versus WAN 2. All important traffic like AWS and Teams, what have you. In this example, we'll stay with Teams. It's business critical, right? I need to be available all the time. Let's go ahead and send out our faster link, right? Let's go ahead and set a route for that, right? So anything that's destined for Teams, right? Send out the faster link. You can set that in your static routes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? It makes it very easy for you guys to go ahead and select that to break that down. And of course, we have SD-WAN, we have where you can configure that, but we'll talk about that later. At the bare minimum, right? You can go ahead and set, which services, right? Which address objects go out which. Okay.
And just to confirm, the IPs is updated like by the FortiGuard servers for like.
There you go.
Okay.
As long as you have a FortiGuard license and a licensed FortiGate, you will get these updated ISDB objects along with signatures for your UTMs.
Okay. Awesome.
Make sense?
Yep.
Right? So again, with this ISDB and of course configured as a static route, even though they're configured as a static route, right? ISDB routes are actually policy routes and they take precedence over any other routes in the routing table. Okay? Even though you configure it here, it's a policy route. Right? And so when you configure an ISDB route, it's going to be added to the policy routing table. Make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. My least favorite topic, IPv6, right? We're gonna only discuss what this guy discussed, right? To enable routing, right, for IPv6, right? You can use the GUI, right? You can go ahead and enable IPv6, right? You can configure a static route, right? But before you do that, you need to go, of course, to system and then feature visibility to go ahead and enable it, right? It's not by default right out of the box. This is something that's an extra, right? An extra feature on the FortiGate, right? And doing this, you'll be able to also configure IPv6 while doing your dynamic routing configuration, okay?
Yep.
All right. Any questions?
None so far for me.
No.
Okay. With that being said, you guys have finished the first section, right? Routing on a FortiGate. So I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions, right? And we'll start here. So, question 1. Which objects can you use to create static routes? Is it A, ISDB objects? Or is it B, service objects?
A.
A.
There we go. All right. Question 2. When the stop policy routing action is used in a policy route, which behavior is expected? Is it A, FortiGate skips over this policy route and tries to match another in the list? Or is it B, FortiGate routes the traffic based on the regular routing table?
B.
Why?
For policy routes?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that it'll be A because the policy route takes precedence over the static route.
Let me read the question again. When the stop policy routing action is used in a policy route, which behavior is expected?
Oh, static route is B.
Positive?
Yeah, I think it's B.
Yeah,
Because if it's no policy route,
it'll have to use the
it
static
it
route.
has to use the static route, like the regular routing table, right?
So guys, look at the PowerPoint, right? The action, right?
Oh, it's just gonna stop it.
Okay. So you guys configuring policy routes, right? If that if statement, right? If we have the matches there, right? We can tell it to either A, forward traffic based on this policy route, or based off, of course, the question that I just asked you guys. If I set it to stop policy routing, I'm telling it not to use the policy routing route that I set up and to use the regular routing table.
Okay, so it's B.
Yep.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, guys. We'll go ahead and end here, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Alrighty, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.